Welcome to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are now joined by Mike Feuer. You know Mike, he was a member of the California State Assembly. He was a member of the Los Angeles City Council. He's now a candidate for Los Angeles City Attorney. We'll talk about that race momentarily. But first, you spent 6 years in Los Angeles as a City Council member, 6 years in Sacramento. You just left Sacramento. Right. Give us a little compare and contrast.
Sure. Well, you know, on the Los Angeles City Council, there are only 15 members for a huge city, so we each had a very large constituency, and one was able to have a very major impact on almost every consequential issue in Los Angeles. In Sacramento, one is one of 120 legislators, and so the role is a little bit different, but the nature of the issues is far more expansive. So I love both in their own ways.
And arguably, you were in Sacramento in probably the most frustrating time in California history with massive budget deficits, and so that must have been challenging.
But you know, at the same time, I'm really very proud of the fact I was able to author some of the most important legislation in the state on public safety and children's health and the environment and a whole array of other key issues. And I have to say that being a legislator is important not because of the status of being a legislator, it's important because of the changes you can make in people's lives. And even in those difficult circumstances, I'm very proud of the work I was able to put in place.
So let's talk about your current quest. You're running for Los Angeles City Attorney. You had run, was it 12 years ago?
Yes.
You were the front runner. There was an upset. Be that as it may, you're back.
Yes.
And what made you decide to run for the office again?
Well, you know, I think the City Attorney of Los Angeles should be the major problem solver on so many issues in the city. That's what a good lawyer does, is it solves problems, usually solve problems for their client. And in Los Angeles, that opportunity has been squandered. We have an opportunity now to change that altogether. There's going to be a whole new array of leaders in Los Angeles. We have a serious array of problems. The LA Times recently endorsed me, and when they did so, they said, given the depth of those challenges, we need somebody who can come in and meld the legal experience I have with the legislative experience I have and solve major issues. And then those are huge.
One of the major issues facing Los Angeles, California, the nation, deals with gun safety, gun rights, gun control, Second Amendment rights. There's so many ways to use the term focusing on guns. I want to get a sense, because it is a little bit confusing to many of us, what can the city of Los Angeles, or any city for that matter, do when you're looking at gun violence?
A great deal. When I was a city council member, I wrote many of the nation's toughest laws on gun violence.
But they were models that were taken national. So explain what the city can do, though.
Well, but to be clear, so for example, I wrote the law that banned high-capacity magazines in the city of Los Angeles. And the current city attorney, against whom I'm running now, had a role in the opposite way. The law firm of Drutanich and Michel went to court to fight to prevent the law I wrote from taking effect.
Interesting. I did not know that.
And I wrote laws to...
but let me, if I may interrupt, how is it that that a city in the state of California and the nation of America can pass a law dealing with magazines?
Because the rules that regard what's called preemption, where either federal or state law is said to be primary and locals can't do anything in contrast to those rules, none of the laws I wrote ran up against the preemption that would preclude a city council from moving forward. So I wrote the law banning high-capacity magazines. I wrote the law that attacks illegal weapons trafficking by limiting gun sales to one per person per month.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because when we think about what's happening in Washington, D.C., it seems that, quote, gun trafficking is one area where the parties, Democrats and Republicans, may agree. So in Los Angeles, we already have that law? Is that what you're saying?
We have that law, and in fact, in the state, modeled legislation after the law I wrote here. And I've written laws to require employee background checks and ban the sale of easily concealable weapons and require trigger locks to be sold each weapon.
And these are all Los Angeles laws.
And many more. And this is why, in this race for city attorney, who should be a champion on gun violence, I'm endorsed by Senator Feinstein in the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence, and former Chief Bill Bratton, and so many others, because the city attorney's office should have, for example, a gun violence prevention unit in the office focused on enforcement of these laws, focused on legislation and litigation and other important roles that a city attorney should be playing, but it's not happening now.
I want to ask you about that whole notion of being a champion for limiting gun access, gun violence, whatever it may be. we've spoken about this before, and I think it's very easy for those in urban centers to be very focused on gun restrictions because we see what gun violence can do. It's right next door, metaphorically and literally. But we're in California, for example. This program airs statewide.
Sure.
And I think it's easy for those that live in urban centers to forget that in suburban areas, in rural areas in California, they don't feel the way we do. I mean, they have very different views on access to guns. And I know you're running in Los Angeles, so you have a certain ballywick, and that's fine. But I don't want us to forget that there are divergent views.
There are, but there's great commonality. There should be common agreement that we should be keeping guns out of the hands of criminals and away from kids. There should be agreement that we should be enabling our law enforcement officials to enforce the rules we have more effectively. So, for example, I wrote state legislation that's been discussed as far away as the New York Times and the New York legislature that requires the microstamping of handguns. It was a law supported by more than 60 police chiefs and sheriffs. The point of the law is that the shell casing in which a bullet is housed should be stamped when it comes out of the gun. If it falls to the ground with a stamp that says the make, the model, and the serial number of the gun. Why? Because then you can tell who bought the gun in California. That kind of law should have common support no matter where you live.
And it's so interesting you talk about law enforcement because, when I was younger, I remember law enforcement and the NRA really being in lockstep on a lot of these Second Amendment issues. It seems as if they have diverged over the last decade or two. Is that your sense, especially since you were in Sacramento where the NRA does try to play a powerful role?
Both in my role as a legislator in Sacramento and on the city council, every time I focused on one of these common sense gun violence rules, I had strong law enforcement support. And I think that's because there is potential for this common ground. I'm not saying the NRA is always going to agree with me. In fact, they've disagreed dramatically. And I must tell you, when they did, I said, I'll tell you what, I will hold a summit on how to enforce our laws better. That was their mantra. Let's find that common ground.
Okay.
They still didn't come.
So what does that say to you?
It says to me that there's a lot of lip service by the NRA that's being given to the notion of enforcing our laws better, of coming together around assuring that criminals and kids don't have guns, and I'm still waiting for the teamwork that we should be aspiring to. Because that's what a good leader does. He or she brings people of divergent views together, synthesizes their arguments, and comes up with a good idea that can garner consensus. That's been my stock in trade as a legislator, a lawyer, and a lawmaker, and I'm hoping to continue to do that.
So presumably, if you're successful as city attorney, you will be the chief lawyer for the city of Los Angeles, but you won't have a vote on the city council.
Correct.
And it would be the city council that would need to pass proposed laws, correct?
Correct.
So what can you do from your office as city attorney to effectuate positive change in laws as you see it?
Well, first, I can make sure our laws are enforced more effectively. And in fact, the city attorney enforces the very laws I wrote.
Yes.
Second, the city attorney should be a leader to whom others look, not just regionally, but throughout the state. The city attorney can say accurately that to enforce our laws, we need to take some additional steps. And I have a couple ideas regarding additional steps that would enable us to do a better job of getting guns out of the hands of so-called prohibited purchasers. Felons, people who have mental disabilities who shouldn't have guns. There's a law in Sacramento, for example, I want to replicate in Los Angeles about getting the law enforcement officials information about when ammunition is sold, because you can tell from who buys ammunition if some people who are purchasing it are not allowed to have guns. In Sacramento, they've gone after prohibited purchasers. We should do the same in Los Angeles.
Okay, his name is Mike Feuer. He is a candidate for Los Angeles City Attorney. He was a member of the California State Assembly. When we come back, we're going to be speaking with Peggy McCrum. She is a member of the Brady campaign in Long Beach, and she recently attended the State of the Union as a guest of Congressman Alan Lowenthal. We'll meet Ms. McCrum when we come back. I'm Brad Pomerance. You're watching Charter California Edition. Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are now joined by Peggy McCrum. She is the president of the Brady chapter in Long Beach, and recently she was a guest of Congressman Alan Lowenthal at Barack Obama's State of the Union 2013. What a tremendous honor that Mr. Lowenthal bestowed upon you. For better or for worse, though, you were an honoree because of your presidency of the Brady chapter, but that's because...
Many years ago, about 30 years ago, my brother Robert Kelly was walking to his car from a store, and he was shot in the head one time, and he was robbed, and he died the next day.
Right.
His killer was never found, and so in the last 30 years, our family has had to deal with this pretty much every day, and it was just such a privilege for Congressman Lowenthal.
And I mentioned to you that I lost a cousin, my generation, we went to high school together, to gun violence. And that was almost 20 years ago, and to this day, it still stings.
It does.
Gun violence in so many ways is just so heart-wrenching for those that are left behind. Before we talk about the issues surrounding gun violence, I would like to talk to you about this honor of yours. Not only did you sit in the chambers during the State of the Union, you met someone pretty special, a special woman.
I did. It was very unexpected. We had gone to a policy discussion near the White House, and they announced that the First Lady, Michelle Obama, was going to make a brief talk, and then after she spoke, she met with everybody in that room. We were all survivors of gun violence. Must have been.
Yeah, and that's the key, is that many congressional members invited those that were left behind as a result of gun violence.
Yes.
And God bless Michelle Obama. No matter what you think about the politics of any situation, I mean, to be in a room with individuals with such raw emotions, and you can see from the pictures that you provided us. I mean, she was there. I mean, you can sense that. And we of course have heard about the tragedy. I believe her name is Haditha, the young girl from Chicago that was killed a mile from the Obama's home. Her parents were at the event. Talk to me about the maybe the word's camaraderie. It's an odd word, but I try. That you felt with these other families.
That's true, because we've all gone through an experience that I think it's difficult to relate to unless you've gone through it yourself. So there is an immediate intimacy, and it's easy to be emotional in front of these people, maybe to cry in front of these people, and to share your stories.
I do want to ask you about the moment when President Obama started his kind of chant of "they deserve a vote, they deserve a vote." Aside from the politics of it, we can talk about that momentarily. That was a tough moment. I mean, I just got chills talking about it. And you were there, so you didn't see how various news organizations panned to your fellows in this movement, with tears streaming down their face. I mean, how was that for you?
That was very emotional, but very gratifying to actually be there and hear the president tell Congress that this is an important issue, and they can't keep avoiding it like they have been in the past. They really have to confront this now, and now's the time to really make a change.
So here's the challenge for the Brady campaign, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know. It's clear that the Democratic president is in support of many of the principles of the Brady campaign. Many Democratic members of Congress are. I think it's fair to say your challenge is with the Republican members of Congress, who have made it clear at a certain level that they're very nervous about giving that vote, to members. It's so interesting. I've talked about this before. I just spoke with former Assembly member Mike Feuer, and we discussed how, here we are in this urban center. We look at gun rights and gun violence so differently than those from rural areas. We're speaking two languages.
I can't speak to everyone's attitude on this issue. All I can do is speak as a survivor, and I just want my voice to be heard, and other people that have gone through this, I want their voices to be heard. We have a perspective that needs to be acknowledged, needs to be center of this conversation, and it needs to be part of the conversation.
But you need to be more than heard. You need to be able to be persuasive. And that's the challenge. And it's interesting. I thought that when Gabrielle Giffords, former Congressman Gabrielle Giffords, was shot, that would begin the conversation. It didn't, in my opinion. It was really Sandy Hook. That's what got the conversation going. You've heard some members starting to waver on this question of more gun regulation, but it's still an uphill battle.
I think anything important that you really want to accomplish is going to be an uphill battle, and I don't think that should deter anybody. I think it's possible. I think it's within our grasp, and I think it's something we really need to fight for.
Let's talk about the politics again. We know that the National Rifle Association wields a lot of power, and part of the reason they wield so much power is their fundraising abilities and their donation capabilities. You know, in the 2012 cycle, they spent over $20 million on various campaigns and independent expenditures. The Brady campaign didn't even break $1 million. Is the tide starting to shift in your mind that you're starting to see increased financial contributions? We know Mayor Michael Bloomberg of New York, I mean, there was a congressional race not far from here in the Inland Empire. He dumped, I think, $10 million into a challenger's race and defeated a Democratic incumbent supporter of the NRA in favor of a different Democrat. So are you seeing some fundraising changes on that front?
You know, I don't think I would have a good insight to the fundraising changes. I think I see more of a public support for better gun legislation. So when it comes to the politics and the finances involved, I just really don't feel I can speak to that, but I can speak to the national sentiment, which I think is in support of better gun legislation.
Is it?
I genuinely feel it is.
And I smile because I just wonder, Peggy, if, you know, I mean, I do work throughout California, so I do have a chance to talk to other constituencies, and I do think that a lot of us who live in urban centers, we may live in a bubble. You know, I mean, the Second Amendment is read differently in Southern California, urban Southern California, than it is in the Inland Empire or in Texas.
But when you look at the polls being taken and some of the data, I think something like universal background checks, I believe it's supported by gun owners and non-gun owners alike. So I think there are areas of common ground that I really think would definitely save lives if we can just implement these changes.
So what are the most important policy agenda items over the next few months for your campaign? Because look, there are many things that can be done. Like you said, universal background checks. There could be gun trafficking laws imposed. There could be a reinstatement of the assault weapons ban, ammunition magazine limits. So many different items. Where do we go?
I honestly, I think everything's on the table, and really it's up to our leaders and our legislators. They're the ones that have to get together and hash this out. They should get input from their constituencies, and if you support this, you should definitely contact your legislators and let them know. But I think it's up to the legislators to hammer out what can be implemented nationwide to save lives.
What's so interesting about this debate is much of what is being debated in Washington has already been debated and passed in Sacramento.
Right.
I mean, when you look, I've seen many maps that show different shades of a color, and a darker shade is more restrictive, a lighter shade is less restrictive. California is always the darkest. We have, in the nation, the most restrictive gun laws. New York, I think, is now caught up with us. So, query whether, I mean, does it matter? We're not in like an area where there are a lot of borders, you know, like Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, right on top of each other.
You know, it does matter. California does have stronger gun legislation, and we have per capita a lower death rate due to firearm injury. So they do definitely save lives.
Right.
What does make a difference is we are surrounded by other states like Nevada, Arizona, where it's easy for someone to go to these states. Anyone with a criminal background, a domestic abuser, they can buy a firearm, no questions asked, and I mean no questions asked. So it does make a difference. We have great laws in California, but we could have even a better situation if we get federal legislation.
So in our final moments, as you were sitting inside the chamber in the Capitol, as a representative of the hundreds of thousands of people that have lost loved ones to gun violence, what emotions were you feeling?
You know, it was, it's very hard to describe. I think the main emotion would be I was just so proud to be an American, honest to goodness. I was so proud to be there and hear our president talk about this very important issue. And for me personally, it was just a very deep and moving moment, and I'll just never forget
Peggy,
it.
thank you so much for joining us. She is the president of the Brady chapter in Long Beach. When we come back, we'll be speaking with a professor at Cal State Long Beach, also about gun violence, gun rights. I'm Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back on Charter California Edition. Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are now joined by Craig Smith. He is a professor at Cal State Long Beach. He has been a speechwriter for President Ford, President George H.W. Bush, Governor Wilson, a long list of very successful elected officials throughout the nation, many on the Republican side of the aisle, which is so very interesting given that you have written an op-ed, many op-eds, about the need for further gun restrictions, although I do mention that George Deukmejian, the Republican governor, was one of the first governors to pass pretty restrictive gun laws in California.
That's right. That's right. I mean, there are sensible Republicans on this issue.
That's your comment, not mine. I'm neutral. But be that as it may. So talk to me about, maybe let's talk about your evolution. I mean, how is it, you head up this Center for First Amendment Studies, not Second Amendment Studies.
That's right.
So how did you go from the First Amendment to the Second Amendment?
I just had a brainstorm one day about fingerprinting handguns. That is, digitally recording the markings a bullet head makes when it comes through a gun in 1998.
Explain that further. So the gun would maintain a little chip?
The gun, no, you don't even need a chip. When a manufacturer makes a gun, they test fire it. You take that bullet head, and it's got riflings on it from just traveling through the gun, and it's like a fingerprint, same kind of thing. You digitalize that fingerprint, you record it with the gun and the number on the gun, the ID number on the gun, and you register that with whoever has it. So if you buy that gun, I know you have it. If you sell it to somebody else, you better tell me, because if it's used in a crime, I'm going to trace it back to you.
So what happens when a bullet leaves that gun? The fingerprint, as you describe it, is on it, and there's a digital number that can be traced. It's almost like a dog chip in a way.
In a way, kind of.
So how is it different from microstamping?
Microstamping is generally done on the casing of the bullet, and the problem is many casings are retained in automatic weapons, in automatic weapons.
Sure.
And you can also go and pick up the casings if you commit a crime and leave with them. You can't get the bullet out of your body, the bullet head. So it makes more sense to digitalize bullet heads than to microstamp casings.
Do any gun manufacturers digitalize bullet heads today?
They don't, but it is certainly feasible.
Are there any states? We can talk about federal in a moment. But as I mentioned earlier in the program, when you look at a map and all the states have different shades, California is always the darkest shade as the most restrictive laws.
Right.
So are there any states, California and New York, for example, that are looking at requiring digitalization?
Well, what happened with this was I proposed it in '98. I got it to the Domestic Council of President Clinton, of all people.
Given who you are.
Given who I am.
Yes.
He endorsed it in his last State of the Union address.
Okay.
Then Dianne Feinstein tried to move it forward in Congress, and we got stopped.
Okay.
So I brought a proposal back to California that we try it here first. I got one of the members of the Assembly to pass legislation that would do a feasibility study.
Okay.
At the time, Bill Lockyer was the Attorney General. He did the feasibility study. They said it was feasible, and then we got blocked again.
By whom?
The NRA mainly, and other gun supporters.
So let's talk about the NRA, because there is no doubt that they wield a tremendous amount of power. Do you believe, and I really want to ask you because you have such a long history in American politics, that their power might be waning?
I think it is. I think that they've overplayed their hand. I think that, we allow registration of guns. When I first made this proposal in '98, the local representative of the NRA said, I don't think we'll have any problem with that. 6 months later, they had a problem with it. So I don't know why they're so extreme in their position. Why don't they allow,
But here's what's interesting. If you look at congressional districts, I just read this recently, over 95% of Democrats elected to the House represent districts that voted for President Obama. Yeah. It's like the same number on the Republican side. 95% of Republican districts voted for Governor Romney. So we don't really have a lot of, quote, swing districts.
Right.
And there's no doubt, again, I'm not commenting one or the other, but it's the Republican Party that needs to be persuaded. Yet if they're not in these districts that are competitive, there's no downside. There's no upside. it's only downside to go against what seems to be the position of that district.
Well, and I think you're right in that. Well, one of the things that happened in the 2010 midterm elections was that the Republicans won so many state houses that they were able to redistrict those states, and they're going to hang on to the House to the end of this decade.
Right.
And so unless you can convince some Republicans to cross over in the House, we're not going to succeed.
At the same time, the Democratic Party is not monolithic as it relates to gun control, we'll call it.
No, you have Southern representatives,
Absolutely.
that are rural representatives. It's great difficulty.
And so, in your expert analysis, where do we go? You know, it was very powerful when President Obama, during the State of the Union, chanted, "They deserve a vote, they deserve a vote."
It was.
But
It was
I
very
understand
moving.
Speaker Boehner's position.
Yeah.
You know, if I were Speaker Boehner, I'd be very reticent to put my members in a precarious position of having to vote for any gun legislation.
It is difficult, and one of the ways that we might help solve this problem is to differentiate urban areas from rural areas. For example,
Right.
in urban areas you have gangs. Gangs can be brought under control using conspiracy laws.
Yes.
As
Gang
you know,
injunctions
as a
we
lawyer,
have.
and take their guns away. Allow Chicago to say you can't have a gun because there's too much gun violence
But as-
in our city.
But am I correct? And I think we were talking about this. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled recently that a local jurisdiction could not ban a weapon entirely.
That's correct.
And
but
so-
that was a 5-4 ruling.
Right, and you talk about this in
All
a
we
recent-
need is a drift of one judge or a replacement of
And
one
let's
judge.
talk about that, because it is your position that allowing local jurisdictions to pass gun restrictive laws is a conservative position.
Yes, it is.
Not a liberal
Yes, it
position.
is, because it's a correct interpretation of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was passed in reaction to Shays' Rebellion. Dennis Shays revolted against the state of Massachusetts. It was a tax revolt. It was put down, but Massachusetts didn't know if it was doing the right thing.
Okay.
And so they wrote to James Madison. They said, "Give us an amendment that authorizes us to form a militia."
Okay.
And he said, well, that you would allow you to arm your citizens. You would give them the right to bear arms in order to form a militia.
Right.
And so that's what the amendment means. It means that the states are in control of giving people guns.
And what about the argument that, as a general proposition, conservative principles look to devolve power away from the central government toward state and local governments? That's a
right.
conservative position.
That's a
correct?
conservative position, and the Republican Party should be in favor of the states' rights to control these issues, not the federal government's right to control the issues. But the other thing is, they also look at original intent to interpret
Right.
the Constitution. And if you look at original intent, when they passed the Second Amendment,
Right.
after Shays' Rebellion, the intent was clearly to empower the states to form
But
militias.
it's very clear that Justice Scalia, for example, and other quote conservative justices are not interpreting the Second Amendment that way. They have a different
I think
interpretation.
that's hypocritical, given that they go to original intent whenever they can go there.
Right.
So why don't they go there in this case?
So you talk about states' rights, and I was speaking with Peggy before. She's with the Brady group in Long Beach. The challenge, though, is that California may have very restrictive laws, but we have porous state borders.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so even though on the coast we may not be near borders, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, the Four Corners. I mean,
Yeah.
is it even effective to have state laws that are different?
It isn't. It's a start, but what we need is a national program. So we need national digitalizing of fingerprinting for guns. We need national registration. We need background checks.
So go back to digitalizing for a second. California now has a 2/3 supermajority of Democrats
Yes.
in both houses and a Democratic governor. Is it time for you to go back to Sacramento?
Yeah, I think it is, and I've already talked to Senator Feinstein about
But that's federal.
doing something on the federal level, and I'm looking at some members of the Assembly up in Sacramento. We're going to have a bipartisan coalition to try and do some of these things.
It has to be bipartisan.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess technically in Sacramento it doesn't.
I think I've talked to some
Right.
who've said, look, we want to see what the federal government's going to do first. Let's see what gets passed in this session, and then we'll fill the holes in like we always do here in California. So we'll see what happens.
His name is Craig Smith. He is a professor at Cal State Long Beach. My name is Brad Pomerance. We want to thank you so much for joining Charter California Edition.